Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
How is India being governed during this pandemic and under what laws? How can we as a constitutional democracy do better? Can we have a 21st century legal and legislative response to the pandemic? M.R. Madhavan, co-founder and president of PRS Legislative Research in Delhi, joins us today to help us answer these questions. Madhavan, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thanks, Pavan. Thanks for having me.
We have seen so much action from the government, and so many notifications and government orders are coming our way every day from state, union and local governments. Can you tell us under what laws we are currently managing the pandemic as a constitutional democracy?
Okay, primarily two laws. One is the Epidemics Diseases Act of 1897, so that's nearly 125-year-old act, which most states used to invoke certain powers to address epidemics. The second act, which was the one which gives center the power to give directions to states and which states have to mandatorily follow, is the Disaster Management Act of 2005. And if you look at the Disaster Management Act of 2005, you can stretch it to say that this is a disaster. But if you read it, it looks like more in the nature of an act supposed to handle cyclones, earthquakes, and things of that type. And it gives the center powers primarily because there could be a disaster which need to be coordinated across more than one state. So an earthquake could hit an area across states. You could have a cyclone, which is, let us say, hitting Andhra and Orissa and Tamil Nadu or something like that, which has happened often in the past. So how do you do a coordinated response? I mean, that was the sort of intent behind giving that power to the center. But at this stage, unless a new act was enacted quickly, center didn't have too much of other choice. And if I look outside the country, I mean, for example, Japan has done an internal emergency. Okay. If we, thanks to our experience of the 70s, amended the constitution to say that we cannot invoke internal emergency. In fact, if you look at Article 352, emergency can be invoked, and I'm just reading it out. It says, whereby the security of India or any part of the territory thereof is threatened, whether by war or external aggression or armed rebellion. So this is clearly none of the three. So you cannot invoke Article 352. So they did not have any choice other than this sort of thing under the Disaster Management Act to do what they wanted to do and what they have done under existing law.
So we have so few legal and legislative options, something as intense and as troublesome as an emergency or something that does not apply fully like a Disaster Management Act. So under this, before we get to how we can do better and how other countries are doing better, you give us a sense of the myriad notifications and government orders and other things coming in. I know that at PRS, you are trying to sort this out for us and also create one repository where we as citizens and as even local legislators and policymakers can follow what is happening across the country and across all states.
Okay, I'll tell you what we know. Okay, so we have been trying to track down notifications issued by center and states. Okay, so as of now, we have more than 4,200, close to 4,300 notifications, 600 plus by the center, 3,600 by states. Now, these are the notifications which we have tracked down. I am sure there are several that we don't, I mean, sitting here at PRS and trying to find them, we must have missed some. So the number is larger than this. Now, this creates a lot of confusion. I mean, just think of 600 by the center in about a month and a half. And some of them were needed because things have moved progressively. So you start with a lockdown and a bunch of notifications. start easing the lockdown, so you have a second set of notifications. That's okay. But it would have been useful if they had done some comprehensive notifications, just a few of them. So at each stage, just do a comprehensive notification so you know what it is, instead of multiple notifications every day. And to add to the confusion, and I work in an area where my core job is to read and try to understand bills and notifications and rules. And there are some of these notifications I've read about 5 times and try to guess what I'm allowed to do or not allowed to do, because I can't understand the English. Okay. So there is a second notification which clarifies the first notification, where the English is slightly worse, followed by a clarification to the clarification. So in all this, somebody might understand the first notification, follow it, not knowing that there is a clarification which is actually reversing something in the first notification, and therefore that person is violating the law. Because if I followed a notification issued, let us say today at 10 a.m., because that's what I got hold of, but at 12 noon, there is a clarification which reverses part of it. I am not aware of it. And as a law-abiding citizen, I am following what I know with latest, which is today's notification, which came out at 10. What am I supposed to do? So that is the sort of confusion that has been created.
So then the writ of the law becomes weaker, and under law, there is no justification right now for citizens to say that we were not aware of the law, right? But that becomes more reasonable when these kinds of notifications, rules, do's and don'ts change by the hour and by the day.
And written in a manner that a person can understand. My English and my ability to read legalese would be higher than the average citizen of this country because of my background and education. I can't understand. So you can't fault people for not following the law if you write in a manner that they will not be able to understand. It's designed so that you don't understand.
So this is still the executive working, Madhavan. This is the government of India. This is state governments, in some cases, municipalities and others also, who are passing various rules. Now, the executive, as you rightly said, can do this much better. And they're also doing this with a bad legal framework, or a legal framework that doesn't completely apply to this context. Now, can we talk about that a little more? How can we reimagine this? What does it mean to have a legislative system and a set of laws that can actually manage a 21st century pandemic?
Okay, I will not blame anybody for, let us say, 1 year back or 2 years ago. Okay, or any time before that, not visualizing something like this and making an appropriate legal framework. No one thought there'll be this sort of a global pandemic, right? So you don't make, and it's not just us. Most countries, most democracies around the world have not had it. But if you look at what happened in India, this was clearly coming in from at least early March. We knew something big is coming. Okay, to the extent that using the Epidemics Diseases Act, at that time, various governments had started putting restrictions on meetings. I live in Delhi. I remember sometime around 14th or 15th of March. Even before that, we had a restriction of not more than 200 people, came down to not more than 50 people in a meeting conference. So the restrictions had started. People had started saying use sanitizers, wash your hands. It was not yet masks though. So it was coming. Okay. Parliament met till the 23rd of March. And it's fascinating to see what did Parliament do in the last week that it met, which is week of 16th March. When you knew things are going wrong, because it was that week, the Thursday of that week, when the Prime Minister came the first time for the national address at 8 p.m, when he actually announced and requested people to follow the Janata curfew on that Sunday. I'm talking about that speech. Parliament was meeting that week. Okay, what was the urgent things they were passing? They were creating the establishment of a Sanskrit university. They were passing a couple of bills related to homeopathic university and some Indian medicines. I'm not saying this is not important, but I am saying, are these as urgent as what is coming up? Okay, what could they have done? They could have had a detailed discussion. They could have quickly brought in a bill which addresses at least some parts of it, gives a framework, through that you delegate powers to the center and the state, even if you don't have a very detailed bill, but you have a different bill other than disaster management, which provides them with the legal powers to do certain things and not to do certain things. Because an important part of legislation And I would say the most important part of legislation is not just to empower, but also to limit the power of the executive, because that's how citizens' freedoms are protected. So you limit the powers also. And maybe have a pandemic act of 2020, which is, let's say, has a sunset clause, maybe 1 year, maybe 2 years, or maybe 1 year or 6 months or 1 year, but can be ratified by Parliament to be extended by 1 more year if needed, or something like that. An emergency situation needed an emergency solution at that time. We did not do any of that. That is a problem.
So one, you're saying that when we knew that the pandemic was a big deal globally, it was a big threat to India as well, you saw a parliament doing business as usual. We've also seen some stories of how some of our senior parliamentarians might have also had a high risk of exposure to the disease as well in the days before the lockdown. So in all this, the lawmaking that you see, isn't that usually proposed by the executive? Isn't it the government which usually proposes a draft bill and then have discussion? Are we in a place where our legislature can do this suo motu, can take cognizance of the matter and start acting on its own?
Expectation of Parliament by the Constitution is that of a body which obviously makes laws and, even more importantly, keeps a check on the government. And in fact, if you look at the speech of Dr. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly debates, I'm talking about the speech when he introduced the draft constitution and explained its provisions. He actually discussed the difference between a presidential form and a parliamentary form and argued why he was proposing, or the drafting committee was proposing, a parliamentary form. And to the forefront, he put the role of accountability of the government to the people through its representatives in Parliament. So that's a very important role. That's actually, I would say, a primary role. Now, what has our Parliament turned up into and slowly become over the last few decades? The last time a law was made, which was not proposed by the government but by a non-government member of Parliament, was in 1970. Parliament hasn't on its own initiated and passed a law in 50 years. So, in law, it examines what the government proposes. It does make changes to it, but it proposes changes. But by and large, especially given the anti-defection law and that in Lok Sabha, at least the government has a majority and issue a whip, it effectively ratifies what the government is proposing. The government may agree after some of the discussions or standing committee recommendations to make amendments. So the government passes amendments. So if you actually look at, and I have been looking at it for the last 15 years, I can only think of one instance or so when amendment moved by a private member was actually accepted by the government when they said, okay, we'll accept it. Otherwise, only government amendments get passed. So Parliament ratifies what the government does in lawmaking. When it comes to other parts, it definitely is unable to effectively check the working of the government. Again, it's become a ratification body rather than an oversight body, which is a pity, because under core democratic principles, in a parliamentary form, we do not elect the executive directly. Unlike the Americans who elected somebody as a president, and therefore that person carries the legitimacy of having been elected by the people. We elect only MPs, and the MPs are supposed to elect the executive and decide and ensure that there is legitimacy to that executive in doing what they do through their oversight. And if the MPs are not doing that, they are, I would say, letting us down and letting down the constitutional design. That's something I am actually worried about.
Thanks, Madhavan. We've seen this decline of the legislature for quite a while now. So how are other parliamentary democracies faring at this time? How are other parliaments responding to the pandemic?
Okay, I'll take one example. There are many others. I'm taking one because I have seen that slightly more closely, but I can tell you about it. The UK. And the reason I'm looking at the UK is, in a way, they are the oldest democracy. They are the guys who sort of invented the parliamentary form and slowly fought with the king to get the powers, and parliament gets the powers. While I'm saying this, let's keep one more thing in mind. There is a structural difference between the UK parliamentary design and Indian parliamentary design, India has a constitution which gives parliament certain powers, and therefore parliament's powers are also limited by the constitution. For example, the Supreme Court can strike down a law made by parliament saying that it violates the constitution. The UK parliament is supreme, so there is a fundamental difference in design. Okay. But keeping that aside, I just wanted to get that out of the way. Okay. What did they do? They had a very quick meeting. They passed an act to address this particular pandemic. That's one. Then they were anyway breaking for the Easter break. When they came back after the Easter break, they created new mechanisms. So House of Commons is meeting. House of Commons has created social distancing in the House, and it has also created a way of secure video conference. So I checked this about a week ago. I don't know whether they have moved forward. When they started meeting, they said the House of Commons has a membership of 650, and they actually cannot fit into the House. So if you have seen any of the major debate, you will actually see it crowded, and it looks like a Bombay local second-class train, right? That bench can accommodate only about 450, and there are 650 of them. Obviously, the issue of social distancing and keeping gaps comes in. Okay. So they said 50 people will sit, and they have marked out the seats with gaps between, etc. And they have enabled about 120 to be able to log in through video conferencing. So 170 are on out of 650, and I guess they will increase that, and they are giving it through party strength at some allocations and things like that to begin with. Okay, that's one. Second, committees are actually, if you go to the UK Parliament website, you will see that all the orders by the government they are tracking, and the committees are meeting and committees are examining what the orders are, and are these orders in letter and spirit within what has been delegated to the executive. There was a press release last week by the UK House of Commons, and very revealingly, the clerk of the House of Commons, and clerk is equivalent to our Secretary General, so it is the senior most official of the House of Commons. His statement is there in that press release, where he says that the Parliament will continue to do its core role of keeping a check on the government. I mean, that is what they are saying as the core role. That is really revealing to me about how they view their Parliament. Whereas in India, we are saying that at this crisis, we should not disturb the executive, let them do their job, and let them not waste their time. To me, in a democracy, the core job of the executive is actually to report to the people. And the core job of the parliament is to ensure executive is reporting to the people. That is a primary job, and it is not a distraction from the role of handling the pandemic. New Zealand has created a committee, again doing video conferencing and meeting, which is specifically on the measures to handle COVID-19. So many parliaments are meeting through various remote meeting tools. The good news is yesterday, PTI News, which has come into its papers, that the Speaker and the Rajya Sabha Chairman, which is the Vice President, had a meeting yesterday, and they have asked the two Secretary Generals to figure out whether we can do remote meeting for committees. I hope they move quickly on that, because it's imperative that committees meet and examine all the orders, some of which are possibly quite problematic.
So, Madhavan, coming back to something that we discussed a while back, even now, India and the Parliament of India can decide to pass a law specifically to manage a pandemic. Am I right? Even now, we can get together and do this if we want to.
There is a slight issue, which is, according to the rules, the committees can meet actually, because technically the committees have to meet in Parliament House, but the chairman and the speaker have the power to allow them to meet outside. They do meetings quite frequently in other cities. They do the study visits. So if they are given permission, they can. The meeting of the House itself, they will probably have to change some of the rules and allow that. But we also have, unlike, which is something I actually don't like, have written against it, But in this moment, this is probably one of the few times when I would say, okay, let us use it. The idea of an ordinance. So you can at least get a law through an ordinance which has to be ratified when Parliament meets next. But the reason the ordinance exists was it was supposed to be for extremely urgent and emergency situations. And this is possibly the most urgent and emergency situation we have seen since 1952. Since we pass about 10 ordinances a year, I don't see any particular problem in passing one for this. So at least let's get the legal framework in place through an ordinance at the very least, and with post ratification by Parliament when they can amend it or change it.
Okay, so that means that first we need to change the parliamentary rules of business such that the parliament can figure out how to meet as the house, as the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha during this pandemic where people cannot be in one position within the house physically. Can be done in the near future on that count?
I don't know, but in any case, our parliament doesn't meet every day, right? So our parliament was scheduled to meet till April 3rd. They adjourned on March 23, so it was just slightly earlier. And they usually come back towards the end of July. Hopefully by the end of July, we'll be in a situation where people can travel again and to some extent can meet. So they can actually look at it at that point of time.
So is this something that can be done even by the Speaker of the House, Madhavan, where instituting new rules of business, calling for an emergency session of the Parliament, some of these things become more important during these critical times, right? So are there provisions to do some of this even before July or at least post-July?
They can do that. The meetings are usually regulated by an order of the Speaker or by the rules. The rules are issued by the Rules Committee and the Speaker can authorize changes there. So if you can actually do a Rules Committee meeting on video conferencing and then use that. So essentially this is the time to find some creative solutions to figure out how to actually get the work done, as long as you are within the constitutional framework and as long as you're keeping with the spirit of the Constitution.
Certainly. And one thing you mentioned is that the standing committees do already have some norms whereby they can meet outside of Delhi and outside of the sessions. So a standing committee needs to stand even during a pandemic and a lockdown. So that is something that they can do right away and create some of these rules and figure out some of these systems over time.
In fact, interestingly, about a couple of weeks ago, I don't remember the exact date, one of the standing committees, the Standing Committee on Labour, has submitted its report on one of the bills, the Industrial Relations Bill. And if you see that report, the final meeting of the Standing Committee, they said, was done through remote technology. Because how else did they actually decide the report? So they were allowed to do that. I don't know whether they just sent around an email and then they sent any objections sent by email. I don't know how they did that. But it says that they had done it not by physical meeting. So you have already done one.
Madhavan, we are a federal country as well. Our state governments are playing a key role in this. State is a health subject, even if the Disaster Management Act or any national act is invoked, which gives the union government more powers. What can state assemblies do differently during this time? Can they also innovate similarly with their committees, with the entire assembly and more?
You have come to a very important point, which is that when I earlier said Parliament has declined, if you look at state assemblies, the situation is much, much worse. I mean, just to give you an idea, on average, most state assemblies meet in normal times somewhere about 25 to 30 days a year. Many of them meet just for 10 to 12 days also. So they are functioning much less. Many of them introduce and pass a bill the same day or the next, which means they are not really examining bills. So state assemblies in general have declined. But the importance of state assembly compared to Parliament cannot be understated. I would say that most issues that affect common people are actually either in the state list or in the concurrent list. Therefore, implementation is by state governments, usually. And therefore, both lawmaking and oversight of the state government in implementing these is even more important than oversight by Parliament over the central government. And they have not been doing it. And they should figure out, maybe this is an opportunity to see, okay, just to give you one more example, we talked about notifications. I just looked up very quickly. Karnataka has issued at least 206 notifications in the last couple of months. I'm saying at least because I have got hold of 206 notifications. I don't know how many have gone outside the off stump, and I am not aware of them, right?
Certainly, Madhavan. I mean, when I track this, you have a fantastic bot that you have created on WhatsApp where we can download some of the latest notifications. From my anecdotal experience, I'm finding that about 80% or 90% of the things have been captured there within the first few days, maybe longer for certain acts and for certain orders.
Yeah, we are trying that, but because we are also capturing it from all sorts of places, we might miss. So I'm saying at least 200. Now, 200 notifications. Who is actually checking, do these notifications make sense? There is usually a committee on subordinate legislation, which the role of which is to look at circulars and notification and see whether these are in line with the overall act, both in letter and in spirit. Okay. Because usually most of them would be in line in letter, because otherwise you can go to the courts and get them struck down. But are they also in spirit with that? So that is the job of the legislature. I'll just take 30 seconds to explain what I mean when I said court and legislature. The way I look at it is, the Constitution gives a lot of power to the executive, right? So the executive is the one which is implementing orders, which has the police force, we can do a bunch of things. So executive needs to be reined in. Otherwise, you could have authoritarianism in concept. Therefore, you have separation of powers and you have checks. And what do the checks do? If the executive does something which does not meet the legal framework, so it violates the law, it violates the Constitution, legality is checked by the higher courts. So the high courts and the Supreme Court will check the legality. But they are not expected to check the appropriateness. For example, to address a particular problem, there could be 4 or 5 different alternative paths which reach different possible final outcomes, but all of which are constitutionally permissible. Courts don't come in. This is where the legislatures come in. They are supposed to examine whether this is the right way forward. And it's very important that they do that, because finally, at the end of the day, the legitimacy for all action in a democracy comes from the fact that we hold periodic elections and empower a certain set of people to do this. And that legitimacy to remain means the people who have been elected and empowered are checking and doing this on our behalf as our representatives. So that appropriateness check legislatures have to do. They have to figure out how to do it. I would say it is the duty to do.
So it's both the duty and only they can do it. Courts and others cannot.
I said the courts cannot unless there is something which is illegal.
Right. So Madhavan, thank you so much for expanding our mind on this, on how we should be thinking about our legislature and its role during this critical juncture. I want to close by asking you, what should we as citizens be asking of our representatives right now? Be it our MLAs, our corporators, or our MPs.
Okay, different things to the different people. The problem is we ask the wrong people the wrong things. So, corporators and in the cities and panchayat members, at the different level, the Panchayati Raj institution members in the rural areas, they are elected but executive. Okay, they are not legislators. They don't make laws. They can make subordinate legislation, but that's what executive does. So they're elected executive. They are responsible for delivering the final leg of various things. So to ask them is, are your local shops open? Are they allowed to be open? Should they be open? Should they be closing? How are they behaving? I mean, all those local level issues you should be asking them. Even during the pandemic, how does the municipal services work? Are they working? What, etc. That is that. The legislators at the MLA and the MP level have a different role. Their role is primarily in the state assembly and in the parliament. So let us say there is distress with migrant labor. This has to be addressed at two different levels. One level is at a broader policy. Are we making the right policy regarding migrant labor? Are we taking care of that at the policy level? That is the job of the legislators. Now, let us say some of them turn up in the villages. They might be carrying the virus. They need to be possibly quarantined in the village area. Is that being done correctly? That is for the panchayat guy to do, not the MLA, not the MP. So that local level. So we should actually be asking the right guy, the right things, the correct questions, and ensuring that they do that. And if they don't do that, well, elections come every 5 years and we should kick them out and maybe try a new set of guys.
Madhavan, thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks and talking about all of this. I would strongly recommend that our listeners visit prsindia.org/COVID-19 to get a sense of the various notifications, government updates, and other things that happen in the meanwhile before we get to some of these reforms and some of these changes in how we are operating as a constitutional democracy. Madhavan, thank you so much.
Thanks, Pavan.
This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from Sarvanaraj, and the episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website bangaloreinternationalcentre.org as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.